Good afternoon from our studio here in New York City. My name is Gad Lebanon and I'm leading our labor market research program here at the Conference Board. And welcome to a special webcast on wage growth. So as you know, with the tightening labor market, we are seeing a lot of movement in different parts of the economy when it comes to wages, a lot of interesting trends. And in this webcast, we are going to share them with you. We are in particular going to deal with several main questions. One is that despite the historically tight labor market, we're still not seeing as rapid of a wage growth as we saw before the recession. So we're going to discuss why that is the case. We're going to share some of the results from our recent salary increase budget survey. There are some interesting results there. And also for the first time, we took this survey and we looked at the results throughout history. So that gives us a unique point of view on what's happening to wages, at least in the salary increase budgets part. We're also going to talk a little about the variation in wages in different parts of the economy. So surprisingly, perhaps to some, wages for blue-collar and manual services workers are rising faster than for the highly educated white-collar workers, which is the exact opposite of the trends in recent decades. So we're going to talk a little about why that is. We're also going to talk about pay compression. We have an interesting situation where wages for existing workers are growing more slowly than wages for new hires, and that is creating a situation where in many cases workers with more experience are making just as much, or sometimes in extreme situations even less than the new hires for the same position. And we're going to talk about the implication of that situation. And finally, we're also going to talk about what are the rising labor costs, what do they mean for profitability, and also a few other topics. There are some credits that you can earn in this webcast, HRCI, SHRM, and CPE. Please specify the type of credit that you're looking for, and you need to type your full name, email address, and there will be 3 OK pop-ups that will occur during the program, so please click them. Also, I want to remind you that if you have any questions, no need to wait until the end. Please type them at the question pod, and we will take them as they come. I have 2 guests with me that will present some interesting findings. First of all, Lisa Freeman from the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. She's the Vice President of Talent Management and Compensation, and she has a very interesting and useful story to tell us today. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Gad.
And to the right of me, Frank Stemmers, Associate Economist at the Conference Board and my co-author on the report related to wages. Thank you for being Frank. So we're going to start with kind of the overview. So for those of you who haven't been paying attention, labor markets are getting tighter. In a span of 10 years, we moved from one of the weakest labor markets since the Great Depression to one of the tightest ones. But despite that, wage growth is, while it has been accelerating in recent years, it's still below 2007 rates, whereas in other indicators suggest that the labor market is much tighter than it was in 2007. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons for that. We're also going to talk about the variation across, as I mentioned earlier, across occupations, the highly educated management professional related occupations. They are accelerating much more moderately, still well below pre-recession rates, whereas the wages for blue-collar and manual services workers the labor markets are much tighter, and wages are growing already above pre-recession rates. Pay compression, this is a real issue for many employers, and it's difficult to deal with, but this is something that companies should deal with. And Lisa here, later on, she will talk to us about what Sloan Kettering, how they are dealing with this problem. We're also, beyond looking at pay compression by age, we are also looking at some other trends in wage gaps, so education, gender, race, and ethnicity. We're going to show you some results there, but just as to kind of whet your appetite, and we'll have a bigger report on that in 2020 on some of those trends as well. And finally, we have this is a difficult period for corporate profits because wages are accelerating and revenues are actually slowing down. The economy, we're not expecting it to enter a recession in 2020, but we are already growing much more slowly than we grew in 2018. So you have on the one hand a slowdown in revenue growth, on the other hand acceleration in labor costs, so profits are being squeezed, and we expect most of that, this trend to continue in 2020. So Frank, what are some details around around wage growth in the U.S.?
Right. So let us. So first we start with like the national picture before we're going to dig deeper into the different trends by occupation, new hires, existing workers. So here I want to point out when we look in the U.S. at the two main wage measures, we look at the blue and the red line, which are the employment cost index and the average hourly earnings. And then in this chart, we have also added the unemployment rate, which is of course the main measure of labor market tightness. So let me start with the dark gray line, unemployment rate. As we see, it's now very low. It is actually more or less as low as it was in the late 60s, lower than in 2007, and also lower than it was in the late 90s, a period that the labor market was especially tight. Now, interestingly, when you look at these two wage measures, what you can see is that there has been acceleration, but still they are lower than they were in 2007, also lower than they were in the late 90s. And of course, this has been a debate about for business leaders, economists. So what are the reasons for this? And of course, we're going to talk about some of the reasons. Some have to do with productivity growth, with inflation. But here in this first section, we're going to talk about the differences across occupations, because there we see actually some very interesting differences, which you have already talked about in the beginning a little.
Right. So maybe before we get to the wages, maybe why do we think that labor markets are tighter for the blue collar and manual services? What other indications we have for that?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe let me first start to this chart where we look at the different unemployment rates, and of course we have a lot of more underlying reasons. Of course, in our big upcoming report, I think we have a lot of pages explaining why we believe that especially for the non-BA population, labor markets are especially tight. So the workers, the people that work mostly in blue-collar manual services occupations. But just to start here, what we're looking at here is the unemployment rate, where we compare it to the unemployment rate of 2007. So basically what we're looking at are the 5 large occupation groups. So I want to start with the red line here. So that are the management, professional, and related occupations. So here, people generally with a BA are working. So what you can see, this line is now more or less around the zero dotted line. So that means that currently the unemployment rate is as low as it was in 2007. Now there's now a very clear difference if you look at the green line, but especially the blue, the light gray, and the dark gray line for the construction, manual services, production, transportation, where we see that the current unemployment rate is now much lower than it was in 2007. So when we think about labor market tightness, we see that labor markets are tighter for the blue collar manual service occupations, which is one of the important reasons, and that is what we can show in the next chart, While we see actually for the management professional occupations still relatively weak wage growth, while for the other occupations we see much stronger wage growth. So this is the employment cost index what we're looking at, and this is the same line basically that we looked at 2 charts ago, but now we have just simply decomposed it. So you can see that for the blue line it's now higher than it was in 2007. For the red line it's not even close yet. And it is also the opposite of the prevailing decade, where first the red line was higher than the blue line, and now you see that has shifted around. So that's also a very interesting development here.
It's probably the first time, at least in the history of the employment cost index, that we see that the blue line is way above the red line. So that's a very unusual situation. And for those of you who are interested in understanding more why that is, we have an 80 or even more page report coming out in a few weeks, so you'll be able to read all about it. But yeah, it's an entire webcast just about this, so we are going to skip this part today. There is a question here. With blue collar and manual services being very tight labor market, how does this help solve problem of homelessness in certain states, as well as disabled people, aging population? So that's a good question. It's actually, as we'll show you towards the end of the webcast, the tighter labor market for people at the lower end of the income distribution is making significant social change. So, for example, if you look at the share of Black and Hispanic population, young Black and Hispanic population that are either working or in school, this is by far the highest it's ever been. Poverty rate for Black and Hispanic people is the lowest that it's ever been. So it's not just a labor market impact, it has an impact on a lot of the social goals of the country that we were unable to achieve for many years. The few strong years of labor market are making a big difference there.
Yeah, I would just also add for the disabled population, you see that it is especially in a high share. The share of disabled people in the population is especially high for people that have low educational attainment, but now we see that the labor market is especially getting tighter for blue-collar occupations, and we do see that the share of disabled people has started to shrink.
Yeah, we are seeing some signs of that. There's a question here about science, engineering, math, and related jobs. I guess that is in connection to wage growth, and yeah, even in those categories. We are seeing a relatively weaker wage growth compared definitely to the blue collar. It is within those large categories there are pockets of a very tight labor market. So, for example, in cybersecurity and in jobs related to big data, we know that there are shortages there. There aren't very reliable measures of wage growth for such small categories, but I suspect that there is quite a rapid wage growth in those small categories. But in STEM in general, we don't see especially fast wage growth now. In one of the things that is happening in STEM, and we talked about it in our last webcast, is that in STEM, in many of the occupations, the labor shortages is a result of, especially of the retirement of the large baby boom generation. In many of the STEM, especially computer-related jobs, there weren't that many baby boomers to begin with, so they are less impacted, and there are also a lot of young people entering those occupations, so that reduces the shortages there. Okay, how much of the increase in all other occupations wages due to increase in the minimum wage? That's an excellent question. We do think it's powerful, so it's not just the tight labor market, it's also minimum wages. We can't really separate the two here, but I can tell you that in kind of the occupations that are really at the lower end, like food services and also cleaning types of jobs, there we do expect the minimum wage had a big impact. Less so probably on the blue collar like plumbers or truck drivers, where they are significantly above the minimum wage and are less impacted there. Okay, so we are moving now to the next section, and this is first a glimpse at our study on the salary increase budget. So just to give you a brief introduction, actually I will move it to this slide so you can't look at the chart, because if you look at the chart you won't listen to what I'm explaining to you. So what is the salary increase budget survey? It is a survey that we've been conducting for several decades now, where we ask compensation specialists how much they are increasing the salary structure, which is, you know, there in many companies there are salary structure, there are various ranges of maximum, minimum, and midpoint, and companies adjust them. Most companies adjust them every year. So we're asking them, how fast are you adjusting those salary structures, and then how fast are you increasing the salary increase budget, which is the budget that is devoted to kind of regular raises in companies. So the definition, doesn't come from the Bible. So different companies have different definitions for what a salary increase budget is, but in most cases this relates to existing workers, and it excludes salaries that are used for new hires. So it is probably a good estimate of how much an existing worker, if he or she stays in your company, how much their raise was on average. So with that, let's go and look at some of the results. So first I'm showing you the salary structure movement. And what's interesting here is that we show it also for three groups of workers: executives, exempt, and non-exempt salaries. They all show very similar pictures. What is interesting here is that despite the fact that we have an acceleration in overall wages, the salary structure movement since 2011 are kind of quite stuck below 2%. If you squint, you may see some upward trend since then, but in general it is stayed low after the Great Recession, well below the pre-recession rates. And if you further look at the salary increase budget, you get more or less the same picture, around 3% since 2011. Maybe some acceleration in the last year or two, but still well below 2007 rates. So despite the overall improvement in the labor market and the rapid acceleration in wages for new hires, we are not seeing an increase in the salary increase budget. Let me pause for a second, because I think I see a few other questions. We hear that a lot of employers are using hiring bonuses to attract workers without raising their overall wage scales. Yeah, so there is some of that. But if, for example, there is kind of an argument that wage growth are not growing as rapidly because benefits are growing rapidly, but in fact, if you look at overall benefits in the US, they are not. We don't see a clear acceleration there. So maybe we are seeing some signing bonuses, but overall, the growth in benefits is not compensating for the slower wage growth. So it may happen to some degree, but it's not a game changer in that regard.
I would note, Gad, that a sign-on bonus, which people do use, is a very short-term solution.
Mm-hmm.
It's only good in the year in which it's offered, and you then end up with the same situation again
Yeah,
the following year because their actual salary hasn't changed.
yeah,
So it's a little bit of a. I don't think it's effective for the longer term,
right.
but it is common, especially in. We see it on the healthcare side in jobs where there are technical requirements and licensing requirements where the ramp-up time for new employees is high.
Yeah,
So you see it in nursing, for example, and
right,
physician assistants.
right. Okay, well, good. Um, Someone says that they completely agree with your comments, so
Oh,
you have
great.
support from the audience.
Not
Yeah.
somebody who works for me either.
Okay, good. So one reason. So what could be other explanations for why the wage growth or the salary increase budgets are not growing as rapidly? Well, there are studies that suggest that the salary increase budgets are related to the cost of living adjustment. And as you see here in the red line, this is the inflation growth. That kind of we smoothed it. We look at a 10-year annualized percent change, but you see a general trend of weaker inflation over time. So in the 80s, it was the cost of living adjustment were much more impactful because inflation was much higher then. But now, as we move into a period of lower inflation, the need to adjust for cost of living is lower. There are studies that show that when inflation went down, the percent of companies that use cost of living adjustment declined as well. So that may also explain part of it. There are fewer companies that are doing cost of living adjustment. And maybe one way to see it, there is a measure of from the Atlanta Fed that looks, or sorry, the San Francisco Fed that looks at people who stayed in their jobs, so job stayers with a wage change of 0 over the last year. And you see that this has been growing, and though it jumped during the Great Recession, and even though it was reduced a little, it's still well above earlier decades. So that suggests that maybe there are fewer companies, fewer employers that are simply adjusting for cost of living. So that could be one explanation: the lower inflation and the lower cost of living adjustment. But Frank, the fact that companies are not increasing salary increase, that doesn't stop the market from demanding higher wages.
No, exactly. So there we see a very interesting divergence between job stayers and people that are moving jobs. So we were interested to find out, okay, we know salary increase budgets are especially affecting like people who stay at the company. While new hires, they probably interview at several companies. They maybe get another wage offer. They can show it to the new employer. So how does that affect their starting salary? Now the problem that we had was that we couldn't directly have data. There's no direct data on new hires. So what we did, we decided to look at the youngest age group. So those aged 20 to 24, because in this group there's a relatively large share of new hires. So in there we compared it in this chart. You can see that in the blue line, we compared the wage growth of this young group to all ages, so everybody combined. And you can clearly see how the cyclical behavior. The blue line after a recession, wage growth is much lower than the overall group. But when the labor market gets much tighter, then new hires get much stronger wage increases. And this, of course, makes sense because in a tight labor market, employers are competing for talent, so they will more quickly offer you a better wage. So you can work for them. While in the loose labor market, workers don't have that many options, so that they will accept a wage offer much faster.
Right, and that creates almost a historical ratio between wages of young people and a little older workers.
Yeah, so what we now wanted to find out is, okay, if we compare this youngest age group to the older cohort, those aged 25 to 34 years old, do we see that the gap between these two age groups is getting smaller? So what we did here is we build a ratio of the wages of these two groups. So basically at the end you see that now the ratio is around 71%. So that means that currently the age group 25 to 34 years old, their wages are, or I have to say the other way around, the 20 to 24 years group earns 71% of the wage of the older age cohort. And as Gert was saying, this is now the highest on record and can clearly show that we have now this wage compression, on which I think Lisa is going to give some more insights.
Right. So within this overall trend, there are many stories probably of cases where new hires or younger workers are entering the organization and making just as much as similar workers with more years of experience. And one of those stories Lisa is going to talk to us about in a minute. But before that, I wanted to ask our audience a question, what they are experiencing. So if the question is, pay compression a problem in your company? So one option is yes, across many positions in the organization. The second one, yes, but just in a few positions. And the third option is no. So again, is pay compression a problem in your company? The three options. I'll let you chew on this for a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's close the survey. Okay, so we have 40% who said yes across many positions in the organization, 47% who said yes but in a few positions, and 13% said no, that it's not a problem in their company. Lisa, Frank, any quick reactions to this survey? Is that what you'd expect?
87% said they're experiencing some form of compression.
Yeah.
So I think it's pretty widespread.
Yeah,
yeah.
And I would say when I saw the first version of this presentation a couple of weeks ago, my immediate reaction was, yes, we know this because we've been experiencing this for some time.
Right.
So I think it's clear from the data that it's accelerating, but it didn't start last week. It's been going on. And my guess is there's a question I see about are these issues specific across all industries or only in specific ones? And I think that the answer is it varies by industry. I don't know that there are any industries that are wage compression proof. Certainly, I'll talk a little bit about more in healthcare. Healthcare is experiencing a lot of wage compression at the moment.
Right. I suspect that it's happening more in industries that hire occupations that are facing a tighter labor market. That's probably where you see it more, and health is one of the industries that is facing a very tight labor market. But I think it's a pretty broad-based. I think we did a survey of what companies are suffering from labor shortages or recruiting and retention difficulties, and very few companies said that they are not suffering, but the ones that did were either companies that hire mostly white-collar workers, almost entirely, or some of the kind of Amazons and Goldman Sachs of the world that really never have recruiting problems. So that was some of the, but I think in general it's very broad-based. So Lisa, why don't you first tell us about you and about Sloan Kettering, and maybe tell us what the pay compression story in Sloan Kettering is.
I need a slide.
Yeah, I will move it to in a second. Here we go. One more?
No, I think it doesn't show yet. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'll take a moment and just tell you a little bit about Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. We are the world's oldest and largest cancer center. We are actually 3 organizations. We are an independent academic research center focused primarily on bench research. We have several hundred principal investigators working in the Sloan Kettering Institute. We are a just about 500 inpatient bed hospital treating patients with cancer. And then we are a corporate entity with all of the back office support that you would expect, HRIS and finance. So we are an extremely diverse employer. We go from security guard to brain surgeon, literally. Mm-hmm. And we're also a National Cancer Center designated center. We are one of the 2 top centers in the country. I always make this comment whenever I'm asked to speak. We hope that you don't need our services, but if you do, we are the best, and we really encourage you to come to us. So that is my ad for today. On the right side is a picture. We're very proud. We have a brand spanking new 750,000 square foot state-of-the-art outpatient facility opening next Tuesday on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. This is the end of an expansion that I'll talk about in a minute because it has impacted our hiring, which now allows us to be within 25 miles of anybody in our entire range. And a little bit of statistics for you on our size and the number of facilities. We've grown enormously in the last couple of years. When I started in this role in 2014, we had just over 14,000 employees, and we're now at 18 and a half. So wow. Part of what I'm going to talk about also is what the growth has meant for us. So I've just kind of previewed this. We have a number of challenges. We can see, obviously, that there are things going on demographically in the workplace, but we're also experiencing real changes in our business, and I suspect that this is true for many of the folks listening in today. A lot of this is related to technology and the fact that we have expectations about people coming in. We haven't really talked about this yet, but one of our expectations is that everybody comes in with skills that aren't part of what I was trained in, and this is about digital literacy, this is about computer skills, analytics, and so on. We also are seeing a whole lot of new roles. So used to be you had cancer physicians and you had computer scientists, now you have computational oncologists. So a lot of shifting in the environment. A lot of these are very specialized skills. This is one of the things that's going on in healthcare, heavily regulated, a lot of licensing and technical requirements. That makes it really hard to just pick somebody off the street and bring them in. The cost of living in New York City and the landscape here is extremely competitive. And we are no longer competing just for healthcare talent. We're competing against Google and Yahoo. We're competing for people from financial services. So the markets in which we operate for talent are much bigger than they used to be. So we have kind of a 2-pronged approach here, but it basically rests on the principle of differentiation. Historically, healthcare has had a very kind of consistent approach to pay. We are seeking to be more differentiated and to become comfortable with that. So our benchmarking approach is quite aggressive. We review our structures and we review our budgets every year. We do regular market studies in areas where we know we're being challenged. We use a geographic differential, which is something for us in New York City. The cost of labor here is much lower than the cost of living here, and so when we're using market data, we apply a premium to give ourselves a more competitive edge when we're benchmarking. And we've introduced a number of practices over the last couple of years to try to respond to some of the things we've been talking about, basing our annual adjustments on not just performance, but also where people are on the market. We've introduced more recently the ability to give in-range adjustments off-cycle to people where we have high performers who are at risk of losing. And we've introduced red circling in the last couple of years where when people hit the top of their salary structure, we no longer deliver their increase to their base salary. We will deliver it as a one-time payment, so it's not compounding year over year. So all of that gives us a little bit more flexibility to respond when wages are, when we're under pressure. I mentioned that we recruit from multiple markets. This is just an illustration of those multiple markets, and they are really different. I just want to stress how in academia, pay equity is perhaps the most important thing, whereas if we're recruiting from high tech, it's about our parental leave policies. You were talking about benefits a minute ago, and I would say that I think we are seeing in some of the markets where we recruit that the benefits piece is actually playing a much stronger role than it used to. And at some point, how that affects wage growth is probably worth looking at. We recently tried to recruit somebody away from Facebook, and so I know what their parental leave policy looks like. They pay a $10,000 bonus every time you have a child. And they have free daycare for all of your children. It's a very, very generous benefit, and it's not reflected in the wage growth.
Lisa, quick question about the healthcare part. So
Sure.
I read a lot about that, and there is now kind of in healthcare they are moving more and more to kind of team-based treatment where they're shifting some of the responsibilities from physicians to people who are kind of
advanced practice providers, nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Yeah, this is a big change in the model.
And so does that mean that the shortage is not just at the physician level, but also at the...
Yeah, and actually there is incredible tightness in the advanced practice provider arena, which is physician assistants, nurse practitioners, and certified registered nurse anesthetists, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And these are known in a less sort of generous way as physician extenders. We don't think of them that way. These are people who are licensed and trained to practice a number of parts of the role that physicians historically played. We're hoping that's going to help, but right now, the availability of that talent is also limited. And there are huge geographic differences, so very, very, a lot of pressure out in the western states where population density is much lower. It is less of an immediate problem in New York at the moment. There are other things that make New York challenging. So I don't think that the way that model is going to be implemented has not been fully worked out. The reimbursement models, which are evolving under plans for Medicare and Medicaid, which, by the way, is a huge uncertainty for us just at the moment. If they ultimately move toward models that are based on outcomes and not on the delivery of individual services, that will have a huge impact as well. So we have a lot of uncertainty in the structure at the moment.
You know, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they do employment projection by occupation, and they project that the number of physicians in the next 10 years will increase by just 6%, but physician assistants by 30%.
Yeah, I think that accords with what we've been seeing, and I think, increasingly there are lots of parts of the physician role that other people can play. We don't know we haven't figured out how to put that all together the right way yet. But yes, I think you'll see more of that. So I promised a case study on certified registered nurse anesthetists. I'm going to refer to them as CRNAs for the rest of the conversation. So a little bit of background here. I've mentioned that we've been expanding, and so we've opened 6 or 7 new sites in New Jersey, the lower Hudson River Valley, and Long Island over the last 4 or 5 years. And those are all outpatient facilities. And so we are needing more and more CRNAs for outpatient procedures. At the same time, there's been a really significant increase in non-cancer related outpatient treatments like colonoscopies. So there's just huge pressure in the market for CRNAs. And as a result, the salaries in New York City have been escalating very, very rapidly. People have been offering sign-on bonuses. This was referenced earlier, but this is about base salary increases. And we were seeing enormous jumps in pay, and on the order of, tens of thousands of dollars every 6 months. We were watching starting salaries go up. So, exactly the problem you described. We were hiring new people in at rates that were higher than what our existing staff were making. The leadership of the institution couldn't believe that we were coming back every 6 months and saying the market's moved again and we need to increase rates. And because we weren't able to really respond, we were experiencing high turnover, and this was actually exacerbating the situation. So people were getting burned out and they were leaving, and we had even bigger gaps, and the cost of bringing people in was just escalating. So we made a series of incremental adjustments and then realized we needed to pause for a second and take a step back. So we chose to take an approach that was effective. It's a lot of work, but it worked in this case. And that was really to say, what's the cost of all of this turnover? What is the cost of the open positions in terms of lost productivity, because people were covering for for those jobs. What do we do about burnout, which was, as I say, a very big issue. And we then also made a real effort to estimate the cost related to searching, interviewing, onboarding, selection, credentialing, because the onboarding of somebody in a heavily regulated technical job it's not 2 weeks, it's 6 months. And so we were able to gather data from across the organization and realized that the cost of the vacancies was 50% of what it would have been if we'd raised to the level we were proposing. We were proposing a substantial jump in starting salaries. And if we'd actually filled every single vacancy with a temporary worker, it was equivalent to 100% of the cost. By going to leadership and saying you're actually not saving any money by not raising your starting salaries and you're burning out your staff, they decided almost, I mean, it was, they said yes, as if they had never said no before. And I can't say that we've solved the problem permanently, but the approach was really effective for us. And I think it's worth contextualizing starting salaries and pay compression as there's another cost associated with them.
Right. So did you said you raised starting salaries, but for the ones that have been in the job for.
So in those situations, and we do this whenever we raise starting salaries, we then go back retroactively and we look at the pay for the incumbents and we adjust accordingly. In healthcare, a lot of pay is based on years of service. So we typically look at performance and how long someone's been in the role at MSK. And so we issued incremental adjustments as well at the same time. So those costs that I'm talking about included adjusting the existing staff as well as the starting salaries.
Right. That's and did you do kind of when you adjusted it for the existing workers, was it across the board, or did you kind of focus more on like your top performers or the ones that you thought are more likely to leave?
Yeah, we use a matrixed approach. We look at performance and we look at position and number of years of service, but we also look at market position. The people we are most at risk of losing are the high performers who are paid low on their market. And that is kind of our touchstone. On the other hand, I will also say we are very fortunate in that we have very low turnover in general. And people don't leave our organization largely because of the mission. And there's real value to that kind of stability in your labor force, especially in clinical care, anything that's patient-facing. So we try to be mindful of that as well. But yes, we do differentiate. We do. It's not an across-the-board adjustment by any means.
So can I ask a question? Has this also impacted the job satisfaction of employees?
So I wish I could answer that question. That's an excellent question, and that is high on our list of things to talk about next year. It's on very high on the HR agenda for 2020. We put this under the broader category of employee experience and are really very, very focused on understanding what it is that our employees want. There's a lot of emergent literature suggesting that once you have base pay kind of correct, it's really much more about the employee experience. Particularly among the millennial group. So we're looking at things like professional development, flexible benefits, and a variety of things that we hope will actually compensate for some of the challenges on the wage front. So I don't know. Certainly the turnover rate has decreased. So that's a quantitative measure of whether we were successful. Yes.
Lisa, there was a question. Can you restate the $10,000 comment that you made earlier? I think it was when you have a baby.
Yes. So Facebook, as I understand it, offers a bonus. You receive a bonus payment with the birth of a child of $10,000.
Okay. And there's another question. Why is geographical differentials only for specialized roles and not for everyone in that work location?
So we use it whenever we're using market data, national-based market data. So some of the market surveys provide us with a New York City cut, in which case we do not apply a market differential to it. So, so, for example, when we're hiring an environmental service aide or a security guard, we're not going to recruit them from Chicago or from Des Moines. We're going to recruit them from Manhattan. So it's actually about where we recruit from that determines where we use the geographic differential, not the nature of the role. We do use it, for example, for physicians, for nurses, for pharmacists, lab technicians, people where we are recruiting in from other parts of the country.
Okay. And there's one more question. Do you see any correlation between companies not being able to ask about current compensation, since it's not legal to ask any longer, and organizations having to pay higher salaries when hiring?
So for those who are on the webcast and not in New York, it is now illegal to ask someone what their current pay is when you're in the process of interviewing them for a new role. We ask, what are your expectations? So we do ask a question. That's not the same as what are you currently being paid. I don't think this is driving salaries higher, but I don't have enough information to say that, other than to say that's my gut reaction to it. The argument in favor of not allowing people to ask about current pay is that it can be discriminatory. And I believe we should be paying what the job is worth. And so I'm actually a supporter of it. I don't know that we've been in this situation long enough to know that whether or not it's actually affecting salaries.
Yep. There is another question here, I think for us. Sorry I missed this, but please explain why the management salaries are not growing very much relative to the tight labor market. So I can give you a 40-minute answer to this question, but I'll just try to do it in 1 minute. In general, the management and professional labor market is not as tight as the labor market for blue collar and manual services, for example. And the reason is partly there are more and more people who are getting a BA in this country, and people with a BA typically do not consider working in blue collar and manual services. They do consider management and professional jobs. So there is a faster growth in supply of workers for those jobs. Then there are several factors that are significantly kind of barriers for or reasons why labor force participation for people without a BA is still lower. One of them is the increase in the share of people who are not in the labor force due to disability. There's been a very large increase in recent decades. It's almost entirely among people without a BA. There also, it turns out that young men are much less likely to enter the labor market if they don't have a BA. Part of it is related to kind of cultural trends in more young men are staying at home and living with their parents, and therefore they have less need to work and pay mortgage or feed their children. So there are some cultural trends related to that. But I know I'm not doing justice to this because it's a very long explanation, but those are some of the reasons.
So, Gad, I'm just wondering whether, because this is aggregated data, how much that might also be because particularly higher level management levels, these are very long. There are lots of long-serving baby boomers who are starting to exit, and the replacements for those folks are coming in at lower levels. And whether that's partly offsetting, making it look like wage growth is actually lower overall, when in fact it's a swapping out.
Right. So that's another explanation for why overall wage growth is not, because there is always people, older workers with higher salaries retiring, and new people entering the labor force with lower salaries. But nowadays, because there are so many retirements as a result of the baby boomer generation, this factor is even stronger than usual, and that also probably pushes overall wage growth a little lower. But we have a few other explanations, and Frank, for example, one of them is the productivity explanation, which is luckily the next slide in our deck. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about 3 main reasons that we believe why wage growth in this decade has been lower. So the first one has to do with productivity growth. So basically the reasoning goes, the more productive you are for a company, the more valuable you are. So the higher wages you can earn for that company. So also the more productive you get on an annual basis, so the high productivity growth, we would also expect that then wage growth is higher. So what I want to show with this chart is that labor productivity growth in this decade has actually been lower than in any other decade. So we're now looking at the blue line, that is the non-farm business sector, so that is more or less the total economy, and the red line, the manufacturing sector. We're looking at 8-year percentage changes. So basically what it means, the last data point for the blue line, that's 1%. So that means from 2011 to 2019, productivity growth was only 1%. And you see that this was much lower than in the middle of the 2000s, but also much lower than in most other periods before where we are now. And for example, the red line for the manufacturing sector, you can see the productivity growth is actually 0. So that means when productivity growth is not really increasing, then there's also less reason to increase wages for these workers. So that is one reason. Another reason has to do with revenue growth. So what we see is that also in this decade, revenue growth has been lower compared to previous decades. So what you can see with the nominal GDP, often we use that as a proxy for revenue growth, you see that it has been lower than in previous decades. So when revenues are not increasing that fast, and there's also less room to increase the wage bill at your company. Mm-hmm. And then the third reason, which we have not listed here, but Geta showed it in a previous chart, we see that inflation is much lower. So if the cost of living is not increasing that fast, then there's also less reason to increase wages.
Right. And we see that this trend of lower wage growth is also occurring in Europe, except in one area.
Right. So actually, when you look at countries in Northern and Western Europe and Southern Europe, they're looking at the US and they're like, oh, wages are really accelerating there, because we don't see any wage accelerations, which is actually kind of odd because, for example, in a country like Germany, where labor markets are especially tight, wages are not really accelerating that fast. Mm-hmm. Still, the clear exception is Central and Eastern Europe, where labor markets are maybe the tightest in the world. We see strong productivity growth, and therefore also wage growth that has been running over 10% now for 1 to 2 years. So there's still the relationship, tight labor markets, strong wage growth, productivity growth, wage growth still exist.
Yeah. So those are several reasons why wage growth are not increasing as rapidly as some expect. We're getting closer to the end of the webcast, but we wanted to show you a few kind of, just to whet your appetite, a few interesting trends in other types of wage gaps. So, for example, what we see here is the wage gap between men and women. And this is after kind of accounting for the differences in age or race and ethnicity or education or state. Like if you compare a man and a woman that have the same age, same race, ethnicity, same education, and they live in the same place, what this red line is showing you that there is still almost 20% wage gap between men and women. Now we broke the wage gap, the red line, into two lines. The black line is between occupations, so that's the gap that is a result of men working in occupations that typically pay more, and men working more in higher paying occupations. The blue line is even men and women within the same occupation, men are earning more. So what the long story short is that this red line has been declining for the last several decades, which is good. The gap between men and women is becoming smaller, but the bad news is that in recent years it starts to grow again. Again, this is just to whet your appetite. We will study, because we don't know exactly why that is happening, but we are going to study this more, and next year we'll have some answers for you. The same is this is the gap between people that are without a high school degree and people with a high school degree. So you see the gap is now the smallest it's been in several decades. That's the red line, is the smallest, and this is partly because a lot of the people without a high school degree, they are less participating in the labor market because they are kind of not the default option in many types of jobs. But now, when the labor market is very tight, they are in a higher demand. So we are seeing some squeeze there they are kind of not getting as much less as people with a high school degree. The same here, the gap of people with the negative gap of people with some college or high school versus people with a BA degree. So here a higher number is good, meaning that the gap is smaller, or well, I don't know, good is a subjective term, but when the numbers here go up, that means that the gap is shrinking. So again, this relates to our story of the blue collar and manual services jobs. They are gaining after many years of a growing gap. We are seeing this gap shrinking a little in the last several years. This is a gap between Hispanic workers and white non-Hispanic workers. That's also, numbers are going up, meaning that the wage gap is shrinking between white non-Hispanic and Hispanic workers, but unfortunately the opposite is true for white versus black workers. There, in recent years, the gap is actually increasing. So again, more questions than answers, but we saw that there are some interesting trends there that are worth looking more deeply later in 2020. Finally, I just want to make one more point that the acceleration in wages are impacting profits. So this is kind of, we're showing the share in the red line of wages and salaries in revenues versus the share of profits in revenues. So you see it's almost a mirror image of each other. And in recent years, when the share because of the acceleration in wages and salaries, we see their share in revenues increasing, and as a result, the share of profits is declining. If we have a few more years like that, and that's just in the non-financial corporate sector. So if we have a few more years of that, profitability rates will go back to the late 80s, early 90s levels, where on average profitability was very low. And finally, to end on a positive note, as I mentioned earlier, the sum of the impact of this wage growth and the fact that it's growing faster for people lower in the income distribution, we're seeing a reversal in the trend of rising wage inequality. So in what you see here are two measures. One is the blue line is the ratio of the 90th to the 10th percentile in terms of wages. The red line is the 75th to the 25th percentile. It's been growing for decades. That's the whole story about the growing wage inequality. But in recent years, it is perhaps reversing, and it's too early to tell if that trend will continue, but at least it's not growing further. And as I mentioned, I think earlier, this also has an impact on poverty level. So we have here the blue line is the total poverty rate. The red and green lines are the poverty rates for black and Hispanic people, and in both of them they are the lowest they've been for many years, if not ever. So there are positive impacts of the wage growth trends that we are seeing. I just want to see if there is any question that I can answer. How specific were the occupations studied? It depends where. Unfortunately, wage growth, there isn't great government measures of wages by specific occupation. they tend to be very volatile. So we usually focus on the higher aggregation when it comes to wage growth. So kind of 2-digit or 20 or so occupation groups in general when we study that. Just before we finish, I just wanted to tell you what are some of the publications on webcast that you may want to look at. So the U.S. salary increase budget for 2020, that report has a lot of what we've talked about. The job satisfaction, there has been a report on that, and just so you know, it continues to grow. A lot of it because of the improvement in wages and labor market in general, so you can read that as well. And we have a couple of webcasts coming up. Tomorrow, window on recession, what recession, and how to measure the impact of a great employee experience. So, and if you have a minute to fill a brief feedback form evaluation, we'd appreciate that. I want to thank Lisa. Thank you very much for coming and sharing your story with us. And thank you, Frank, for being here and sharing your insights. Thank you to all of our audience. Thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.